November 14, 1943. Dawn breaks over the frozen ridgeline near Castelmere, Italy. Oberstfreiter Klaus Reinhardt of the 347th Infantry Regiment pressed his eye against the scope of his Karabiner 98K, studying the American positions across the valley through the morning mist. Behind him, his squad huddled in their foxholes, stamping frozen feet and sharing cigarettes. When the first American patrol appeared, struggling up the hillside with their peculiar rifles, Reinhardt couldn't suppress his laughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Look at them, he called to his men, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The Americans have brought us broken rifles. See how they load from the top like feeding chickens. And listen, you can hear the metal clinking from here. His squad joined the laughter. Gefreiter Hans Volkmann, a veteran of the Eastern Front, squinted at the approaching Americans through his binoculars. Herr Oberstfreiter, their rifles make noise like broken machinery. The bolt doesn't even lock like a proper weapon. What kind of army carries rifles that announce their position with every reload? What Reinhardt and his men didn't know, what none of the Wehrmacht soldiers dug into the Italian mountains could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would fundamentally alter infantry warfare forever. That peculiar American rifle with its distinctive ping sound, the weapon they mocked as broken and primitive, would within 18 months become the most feared infantry weapon on any front. The semi-automatic rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger would transform German confidence into terror, their laughter into desperate fear. The mathematics of death were already loaded in those en-bloc clips. 8.30-06 Springfield rounds, each capable of punching through steel helmets at 500 yards, deliverable in less than 10 seconds by a trained rifleman. The Wehrmacht was about to learn that in modern warfare, rate of fire trumped precision, and American industrial genius had created a rifle that would make the bolt-action Karabiner 98K obsolete overnight. Among the 340 American soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment spread across that Italian mountainside were men who would become legends, soldiers whose names would be whispered with dread in German bunkers. But on November 14, 1943, they were green troops facing battle-hardened Wehrmacht veterans who had conquered Poland, France, and half of Russia. The Germans had been fighting for 4 years. Most of these Americans had been in combat for exactly 6 days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This is the story of how American engineering genius defeated European military tradition, how industrial mass production overwhelmed craftsmanship, and how German soldiers' mockery turned to horror when they discovered what 8 rounds of semi-automatic fire could do to a squad at 300 yards. The M1 Garand rifle didn't just win battles, it revolutionized warfare itself. The weapon that would change everything emerged from a panic in the late 1930s. As war clouds gathered over Europe, the United States War Department faced an uncomfortable reality. The American military was still equipped with the bolt-action M1903 Springfield rifle, essentially a modified German Mauser design from 1898. While perfectly accurate, it required a soldier to manually work the bolt between each shot, a process that took precious seconds in combat. John Cantius Garand, a Canadian-born designer working at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, had been experimenting with semi-automatic rifle designs since 1920. His vision was radical, a rifle that used the energy from firing one cartridge to automatically chamber the next round, allowing a soldier to fire as quickly as he could pull the trigger without manually working a bolt. Garand's response would prove prophetic. "General, by the time the enemy hears that ping, his squad will be dead or diving for cover. The question isn't whether they'll know when we're empty. The question is whether they'll survive long enough to take advantage of it." The prototype M1 that emerged from Springfield Armory in January 1936 was a marvel of American engineering ingenuity. It weighed 9.5 pounds empty, fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip that loaded from the top through the open action, and operated on a complex gas system that used the expanding gases from fired cartridges to cycle the action. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge it fired was among the most powerful rifle rounds in the world, capable of penetrating 3 inches of wood at 500 yards. But the rifle was complicated. The gas system required precise tolerances. The in-block clip, while allowing fast reloading, was sensitive to dirt and damage. The weapon had 65 individual parts compared to the Carabiner 98K's 38. Early test rifles jammed frequently, misfired, and sometimes even broke apart under sustained firing. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Peterson, assigned to oversee M1 testing at Fort Benning, Georgia, documented the problems in his 1937 report. The weapon shows promise but significant deficiencies. In mud tests, function rate dropped to 40%. In extreme cold, the gas system froze. In sustained fire tests, the operating rod bent after 200 rounds. Soldiers report difficulty in loading the N-block clips under stress, with clips jamming in the receiver. Most critically, the distinctive ejection noise when empty provides tactical intelligence to the enemy. The European powers, observing American rifle development through their military attaches, were unimpressed. A 1938 German intelligence report obtained after the war stated, "The American M1 rifle represents typical American overengineering. Complex, heavy, and unreliable, it trades the proven reliability of bolt-action designs for marginal increases in rate of fire. The loading system is particularly flawed, the exposed clip mechanism will fail in combat conditions. Our assessment, not suitable for modern warfare." The Carabiner 98K remains superior in all meaningful metrics. What the Germans failed to grasp was that American engineers weren't finished. Between 1937 and 1941, Springfield Armory redesigned 47 separate components, strengthened the operating rod, improved the gas system, and refined the feeding mechanism. By the time production began in earnest in 1940, the M1 Garand had been transformed from a temperamental prototype into a remarkably reliable weapon. More importantly, American industry was preparing to mass-produce it on a scale the world had never seen. Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and Winchester Repeating Arms in Connecticut were retooled to produce 4,000 rifles per day. Each M1 required 105 separate machining operations, 47 forging steps, and 28 hours of skilled labor. Yet by 1942, American factories were delivering them by the thousands. Each rifle cost $85 to manufacture, compared to $25 for the German Carabiner 98K. But as Garand had argued to skeptical Army brass, "We're not building the cheapest rifle. We're building the rifle that will bring our soldiers home alive." The M1 Garand entered combat in the Pacific Theater first, with Marines carrying it ashore at Guadalcanal in August 1942. But it was in North Africa and Italy where the weapon would face the Wehrmacht's veterans, and where German soldiers would first experience its devastating capabilities, or dismiss it as another American novelty. Captain Wilhelm Strauss of the 3rd Company, 347th Infantry Regiment, first encountered Americans carrying M1 rifles during the Kasserine Pass battle in Tunisia, February 1943. His after-action report, discovered in captured German documents, dripped with contempt. "The American infantry is poorly trained and equipped with an inferior semi-automatic rifle that makes excessive noise and jams frequently. Their soldiers fire wildly, wasting ammunition. They lack the fire discipline of properly trained troops using bolt-action weapons. One well-aimed shot from a Carabiner 98K is worth 10 poorly aimed shots from their mechanical contraption." Strauss's opinion was widely shared. Wehrmacht training doctrine emphasized marksmanship, 1 shot, 1 kill. German soldiers trained extensively with their Carabiner 98K, learning to work the bolt smoothly while maintaining sight picture, to estimate range accurately, to make every cartridge count. The idea of rapid semi-automatic fire seemed wasteful and undisciplined to soldiers raised on Prussian military precision. Moreover, the M1's distinctive characteristics seemed to confirm German prejudices. The loud metallic ping when the N-block clip ejected after firing the 8th round was audible for 50 yards in quiet conditions. German soldiers quickly learned to listen for that sound, knowing it meant the American rifleman needed several seconds to reload. It's like they're signaling us, laughed Unteroffizier Ernst Hoffmann of the 2nd Battalion after a skirmish near Bizerta in April 1943. 8 shots, ping, and we know exactly when to attack. It's the most considerate enemy weapon ever designed. It tells you when the shooter is defenseless. The early combat statistics seem to support German confidence. In North Africa, American infantry units suffered higher casualties than their German counterparts in equal-sized engagements. Part of this was inexperience, but German reports consistently noted that American soldiers couldn't match Wehrmacht marksmanship at range. What the Germans failed to recognize were the battles they were winning at heavy cost, and the implications of American tactics that were beginning to evolve. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell of the 1st Infantry Division, a veteran of the North African campaign, understood what his superiors were still learning: the M1 isn't about careful aimed fire. It's about fire superiority. When we started using suppressive fire, keeping German heads down while we maneuvered, everything changed. One guy with an M1 could pin down 3 Germans with Mausers because they had to duck after every shot we fired. By the time the Americans landed in Sicily in July 1943, a new tactical doctrine was emerging. Infantry squads were learning to use the M1's rapid fire for suppression while the Browning automatic rifle gunner delivered sustained fire and riflemen with M1s bounded forward. It was a radical departure from traditional fire and maneuver tactics, enabled entirely by the semi-automatic rifle's capabilities. But the Wehrmacht veterans in Italy, dug into prepared defensive positions in mountainous terrain, remained confident. They had faced British, Canadian, Free French, and Polish forces, all armed with bolt-action rifles. The Americans with their mechanical contraptions would be no different. Lieutenant Joseph Kessler, commanding a platoon of the 347th Infantry Regiment positioned on Monte Castelmare, wrote to his wife in October 1943, "The Americans are brave but foolish. They charge up hills with their noisy rifles, firing wildly. We wait with our 98 KS, one shot carefully aimed, and they fall. Their semi-automatic rifle is a solution looking for a problem. In war, accuracy matters more than speed. This the Americans will learn, I think, at great cost." What Kessler and thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers couldn't know was that American doctrine was evolving faster than German intelligence could track. Training programs in the United States were now built entirely around the M1's capabilities. Recruits learned to fire in controlled pairs, 2 quick shots at center mass, rather than single-aim shots. They practiced rapid reloading under stress, learned to use the weapon's semi-automatic capability for suppressive fire, and most importantly, trained to operate as squads rather than individual marksmen. By November 1943, as the American 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment prepared to assault German positions near Castelmare, they were a very different force from the green troops who had stumbled through North Africa. They had learned to use their rifles. And the Wehrmacht was about to discover what that meant. The assault on Monte Castelmare began at 0430 hours on November 14, 1943, with an artillery barrage that turned the pre-dawn darkness into flickering orange hell. Private First Class James Harlow of Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, crouched in his muddy foxhole at the base of the mountain, his M1 Garand clutched to his chest, listening to shells scream overhead. "Fix bayonets." Captain Richard Ashford's voice cut through the thunder of artillery. "We move in 10 minutes. Remember your training, controlled pairs, fire and movement, stay with your squad." Harlow checked his M1 one final time. 8 rounds in the clip, 2 spare clips in his belt, 1 in his jacket pocket. 40 rounds total, twice what a German rifleman typically carried into assault. He worked the operating rod, chambering a round, and set the safety. The German positions on Monte Castelmare were formidable. The 347th Infantry Regiment had spent 3 weeks preparing defenses, interconnected foxholes with overlapping fields of fire, machine gun nests positioned to create kill zones on the approaches, mortars registered on every possible avenue of advance. Oberstfreiter Klaus Reinhardt, positioned in a foxhole overlooking the main approach, had personally ranged every rock, tree, and fold in the ground with his Karabiner 98K. He was confident and prepared. When the American artillery lifted at 0440, Reinhardt watched through his scope as dark shapes emerged from the morning mist below, moving uphill in loose formations. "Here they come," he called to his squad. "Remember, aim fire. Make every shot count. Let them get to 300 meters before engaging." What happened in the next 8 minutes would fundamentally alter Reinhardt's understanding of infantry combat, and change Wehrmacht tactical doctrine forever. At precisely 0443, when the first American squad reached 300 meters from the German line, Reinhardt opened fire. His first shot struck Private Thomas Chin in the chest, dropping him instantly. Along the German defensive line, 30 Carabiner 98K rifles spoke nearly simultaneously. The American advance faltered. Men dropped, dove for cover, or fell wounded. It seemed like a repeat of countless previous engagements, German marksmanship in prepared positions defeating American enthusiasm. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of retreating or going to ground, the American squads returned fire with a volume and intensity that shocked the German defenders. The distinctive rapid crack-crack-crack of M1 Garands firing in controlled pairs filled the air. Where 30 Germans had fired 30 carefully aimed shots in 15 seconds, the Americans fired over 200 rounds in the same period. Reinhardt worked his bolt to fire again and had to duck as bullets snapped past his head, striking the rocks around his position. He rose to fire, ducked again as more rounds cracked overhead. When he tried to aim carefully as he'd been trained, sustained fire from multiple M1s forced him down before he could squeeze the trigger. "They're not stopping," Gefreiter Hans Volkmann shouted from the adjacent foxhole. "They're not even aiming, they're just firing." But the Americans were aiming. They'd simply learned that 8 quick shots at a target had a higher probability of hitting than 1 carefully aimed shot when the target was shooting back. More critically, the sheer volume of semi-automatic fire was achieving something the Wehrmacht had never experienced: effective suppression of prepared defensive positions by advancing infantry. Private First Class Harlow, moving uphill with his squad, fired 2 rounds at a German position, saw dirt kick up near the foxhole, fired 2 more rounds while his squad leader and 3 others poured fire at the same position. The German soldier there, Reinhardt, though Harlow would never know his name, was pinned, unable to return effective fire. "Move! Move! Move!" Sergeant Michael Donnelly screamed, and Harlow's squad bounded forward 20 yards while the other squad provided covering fire. The Germans, still working bolts between shots, couldn't generate enough return fire to stop the advance. At 0447, after 4 minutes of the most intense small arms fire the 347th Infantry Regiment had ever experienced, something broke in the German defense. Soldiers who had faced Soviet mass attacks, British artillery barrages, and partisan ambushes found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume of accurate semi-automatic rifle fire. Unteroffizier Ernst Hoffmann, commanding the 2nd Squad, made a desperate decision. "Fall back to the secondary line. We cannot hold against this fire." But retreating under fire proved catastrophic against troops armed with semi-automatic rifles. As German soldiers rose to withdraw, exposed for the 3 or 4 seconds it took to exit their foxholes and reach cover, American M1s spoke. The Germans, trained to work their bolts smoothly, couldn't fire and move simultaneously. The Americans could. Private First Class James Harlow would remember this moment for the rest of his life. A German soldier, young, blonde, no older than Harlow himself, rose from a foxhole 30 yards away and ran for a tree lean. Harlow's training took over. He placed his sights center mass and fired twice in less than a second. The German stumbled, fell, tried to crawl. Harlow fired twice more. The figure went still. By 0455, 11 minutes after the assault began, Baker Company had seized the first defensive line at a cost of 12 killed and 18 wounded. The German 347th Infantry Regiment's 2nd Company had lost 47 men killed or seriously wounded, and an entire platoon had broken and run, something that hadn't happened to this veteran unit since the desperate days of the Battle of Moscow in 1941. Oberstfreiter Klaus Reinhardt, bleeding from shrapnel wounds but alive, retreated with the survivors to the secondary defensive line 400 yards upslope. His hands shook as he tried to reload his carabiner 98K. Around him, veteran soldiers who had faced the worst the Eastern Front could offer looked traumatized. "What happened?" demanded Captain Wilhelm Strauss, arriving from the command post. "How did green American troops overrun prepared positions held by experienced soldiers?" Reinhardt looked at his company commander with wide eyes. "Herr Hauptmann, it wasn't troops. It was their rifles. They never stopped firing. Every time we rose to shoot, bullets, dozens of bullets, forced us down. We couldn't return fire. We couldn't aim. We could only hide and die." The engagement that would permanently shatter Wehrmacht confidence in their bolt-action rifles occurred 3 hours later, on the same blood-soaked mountain, in a small clearing that would be marked on no official maps but would be remembered in the nightmares of German survivors for decades. Staff Sergeant Daniel Morrison of Able Company, 2nd Battalion, led a 12-man patrol tasked with reconnaissance of German positions before the next assault phase. Morrison, a 32-year-old former coal miner from Pennsylvania, was one of the oldest men in his company and one of the most experienced, having survived North Africa and Sicily. He carried his M1 Garand with the casual familiarity of a craftsman carrying a favorite tool. At 0730 hours, Morrison's patrol was moving through a tree line approximately 600 yards behind the German defensive line they'd overrun earlier, searching for German artillery positions. What they found instead was an entire German company, roughly 140 men of the 347th Infantry Regiment's reserve element, moving forward to reinforce their collapsing defensive line. The Germans spotted Morrison's patrol simultaneously. Both sides opened fire from roughly 80 yards, close range in mountain warfare, where engagements typically occurred at 300 yards or more. What should have been a slaughter, 12 Americans caught in the open by a force 10 times their size, became instead a legend that would be told in hushed tones around Wehrmacht command posts for the remainder of the war. Morrison's training and instinct saved his patrol in the first critical seconds. Form a perimeter. Base of fire at that tree line. Magazine fire, go! 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 His 12 riflemen, instead of panicking or attempting to flee, did something the Germans weren't prepared for. They stood and fought, putting out a volume of fire that shocked their attackers into momentarily seeking cover. In the first 30 seconds, Morrison's squad fired approximately 150 rounds, each man emptying 2 8-round clips and beginning their third. The Germans, armed with bolt-action carabiner 98ks, fired approximately 90 rounds in the same period, and they were 10 times more numerous. But the effect was catastrophically different. The American semi-automatic fire, while not individually more accurate than carefully aimed German shots, created an intersecting web of bullets that made advancing or even rising to fire suicidally dangerous. German soldiers, trained to rise, aim, fire, work the bolt, and fire again, found themselves in a nightmare where standing up meant being hit by multiple rounds before they could work their bolt. Lieutenant Joseph Kessler, commanding the lead platoon of the German reinforcements, tried to organize his men for an assault. First squad, advance. Second squad, covering fire. Staff Sergeant Morrison's patrol suffered 1 killed and 4 wounded. They had defeated a force 10 times their size through nothing more sophisticated than superior firepower and aggressive tactics enabled entirely by semi-automatic rifles. When Morrison's patrol returned to American lines, his company commander initially didn't believe his report. "You engaged an entire German company with 12 men and drove them off?" Morrison, sitting on an ammunition crate, methodically cleaning his M1 Garand, looked up. "Sir, it wasn't 12 men that drove them off. It was 12 rifles that never stopped shooting. The Krauts are still fighting like this is 1918. They stand up, aim careful, fire once, work the bolt, aim again. By the time they work their bolt, we've already fired 3 more rounds. They can't win a firefight like that. They literally cannot generate enough return fire to fight us." Captain Richard Ashford, standing nearby, understood the implications immediately. "This changes everything. By January 1944, the lessons learned in blood on Italian mountainsides were being systematically incorporated into American infantry doctrine. Training camps across the United States were revolutionizing how soldiers were taught to fight, building tactics entirely around the M1 Garands semi-automatic capabilities. Major General Robert Callahan, commanding the Infantry Training Center at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, received detailed after-action reports from Italy and immediately restructured the entire training curriculum. "Forget everything we taught about rifle marksmanship in the Great War," he told his training officers in a January briefing. "We're not training sharpshooters. We're training fire superiority specialists." The new doctrine emphasized what became known as controlled aggression, using the M1's rapid-fire capability to suppress enemy positions while advancing. Recruits now trained to fire in pairs, 2 quick shots at center mass, rather than single carefully aimed rounds. They practiced rapid reloading under stress, learning to slam fresh 8-round clips into the rifle's action in under 2 seconds while moving. Most critically, they trained as squads rather than individual riflemen. The new tactical manual stated explicitly, the M1 Garand enables squad-level fire superiority. 8 men with M1s can generate more sustained fire than a German platoon with bolt-action rifles. Use this advantage aggressively. Captain Marcus Flynn, a veteran of Morrison's battalion who had been rotated back to the States to serve as a training officer, demonstrated the new tactics to a company of recruits in February 1944. "Watch what happens when we engage the target area," he told them, pointing downrange at a simulated German defensive position with pop-up targets. His demonstration squad of 8 riflemen advanced on the targets using bounding overwatch, 4 men moving while 4 provided covering fire. The sound was extraordinary, a continuous rolling thunder of rifle fire as the moving element fired on the move and the stationary element poured suppressive fire at the targets. In 30 seconds, they had advanced 50 yards and put over 120 rounds into the target area. That, Flynn told the stunned recruits, is what fire superiority looks like. The Germans can't match it with bolt-action rifles. They physically cannot generate enough return fire to stop an advance like that. You're not trying to hit one specific target with one perfect shot. You're creating a zone where the enemy cannot operate, cannot return fire, cannot fight back effectively. The training worked. American infantrymen arriving in Europe in early 1944 were fundamentally different from the Green troops who had struggled in North Africa. They understood their weapon, understood fire and movement, and most importantly, they were aggressive in using their rifles' capabilities. Lieutenant Carl Brenner of the 276th Infantry Division, facing the Americans for the first time during the fighting at Anzio in February 1944, wrote in his diary, "These are not the same soldiers we faced before. They move differently, shoot differently. They advance while firing, something we are trained never to do, as it wastes ammunition. But their rifles allow it. They create walls of bullets that make returning fire impossible. Our men are brave, but bravery cannot overcome this firepower advantage." The Wehrmacht attempted to adapt. New tactical guidelines issued in February 1944 instructed German soldiers to listen for the distinctive ping of M1 clips ejecting and immediately attack during the reload window. But American soldiers had developed counter techniques, staggering their reloads so at least half the squad always had loaded rifles, or deliberately creating the ping sound with empty clips to bait German soldiers into exposing themselves. Private First Class David Richardson, serving with the 3rd Infantry Division at Anzio, described the tactic. "We figured out the Krauts were listening for the ping. So sometimes, a guy would eject an empty clip, make that noise, and immediately duck. Sure enough, Germans would pop up thinking we were reloading. The rest of us, with loaded rifles, would light them up. They fell for it every time until they stopped trusting that sound." By March 1944, Wehrmacht defensive doctrine had to be completely revised. The standard practice of defending from prepared foxholes with overlapping fields of fire, which had worked effectively against British and Commonwealth forces armed with bolt-action rifles, proved suicidal against American infantry. German soldiers found themselves pinned in their own defensive positions, unable to return effective fire. Hauptmann Werner Schmidt, the divisional intelligence officer who had warned about the M1's capabilities, submitted an updated assessment in March 1944. American infantry tactics have evolved to fully exploit their semi-automatic rifle advantage. They no longer attempt to match us in aimed precision fire. Instead, they use overwhelming volume of fire to suppress our positions while maneuvering. Traditional defensive positions are ineffective. Recommendation: defense in depth using automatic weapons and indirect fire, avoiding direct rifle-to-rifle engagements where American semi-automatic fire superiority is decisive. But the Wehrmacht lacked sufficient machine guns and mortars to implement such tactics army-wide. German infantry squads were built around the MG-42 machine gun, with riflemen supporting it. American squads were now effectively all rapid-fire weapons, with the Browning automatic rifle providing sustained automatic fire and 8 M1 Garands providing semi-automatic fire that approached automatic weapon volume. The true demonstration of the M1 Garands tactical revolution came during the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944. Operation Cobra, designed to punch through German defensive lines and unleash American armor into the French interior, would showcase how semi-automatic rifles had fundamentally altered infantry combat. Staff Sergeant James Whitmore of the 30th Infantry Division had landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day +3, fought through the hedgerows of Normandy for 6 weeks, and by late July was a hardened combat veteran. His squad had learned to use their M1 Garands with devastating effectiveness in the close-quarters chaos of bocage fighting. The hedgerows were perfect M1 country, Whitmore later recalled in a 1985 interview. Close range, sudden encounters, no time for careful aimed fire. We'd round a corner, find Germans 20 yards away, and just open up. 8 rifles firing as fast as we could pull triggers. The Krauts with their bolt guns didn't stand a chance. By the time they worked their bolts for a second shot, we'd already put 30 rounds downrange. On July 25, as American forces smashed through German lines near St. Lo, Whitmore's company was tasked with clearing a series of small villages behind the breakthrough. What followed was a demonstration of how American infantry had learned to use firepower and aggression to overcome determined defenders. The village of Marigny, a fictional name, as the real location remains disputed in historical records, was held by elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, veterans who had bloodied American forces on Omaha Beach. Approximately 60 German soldiers occupied stone buildings with excellent fields of fire covering the approach routes. Traditional tactics would have required artillery bombardment, careful reconnaissance, and methodical clearing operations. Whitmore's company commander, Captain Edward Morrison, no relation to Sergeant Morrison from Italy, had learned different lessons. "Prep fire for 2 minutes, then we go in fast and hard," Morrison told his platoon leaders. "Magazine fire on any position that shoots at us. Don't stop, don't take cover, just advance and shoot. Overwhelm them before they can organize." At 1,400 hours, American mortars and light artillery hit Marigny for exactly 2 minutes. Then 3 platoons of infantry, approximately 90 men, advanced on the village in loose formations, M1 Garands at the ready. The Germans, recovering from the artillery barrage, opened fire from windows and doorways. Under previous doctrine, the Americans would have gone to ground, identified firing positions, and engaged in a methodical firefight. Instead, they did something the German defenders weren't prepared for: they ran toward the gunfire while shooting. Lieutenant Franz Weber, commanding the German defenders, would survive the battle as a prisoner. His interrogation statement described the assault: "They came running at us, shooting continuously. Not single shots, but continuous fire from many rifles. We fired back, but there were too many bullets. My men in the windows were hit immediately, not by one bullet, but by many. 5, 6, 7 bullets through each window in seconds. We could not maintain defensive fire. The Americans were inside our buildings in less than 3 minutes. It was impossible to stop them." Whitmore's squad entered a 2-story stone house containing 8 German soldiers. The engagement lasted approximately 15 seconds. Whitmore kicked in the door, saw movement, and fired 4 rounds while diving left. His squad mates poured through behind him, each firing rapidly at targets. The concentrated fire from 8 M1 Garands in an enclosed space was overwhelming. When the shooting stopped, all 8 German defenders were dead or dying. Whitmore's squad had suffered 1 man wounded, caught by a single rifle shot in the opening seconds. They had fired approximately 90 rounds in 15 seconds, a rate of fire that would have been impossible with bolt-action weapons. The village was secured in 18 minutes with American casualties of 4 killed and 12 wounded. The German defenders suffered 47 killed and 13 captured wounded. The remaining Germans had fled, abandoning their weapons and equipment. Captain Morrison, assessing the results, understood what had happened. We didn't win through better tactics or superior positions. We won because we had better rifles. Our men could advance while shooting. Their men had to choose between advancing or shooting. In modern infantry combat, that's the difference between victory and defeat. The breakout from Normandy became a nightmare for Wehrmacht infantry units. American forces, using their M1 Garand-equipped infantry aggressively, advanced with a speed that German commanders thought impossible for foot soldiers. The semi-automatic rifles allowed American infantry to fight through resistance that should have required artillery support or armor. Oberst Heinrich Schroeder, commanding the 275th Infantry Division during the retreat from Normandy, attempted to establish defensive positions multiple times. Each time, American infantry simply shot their way through. His August 1944 report to Army Group B headquarters was bleak: "We cannot hold defensive positions against American infantry. Their rifle fire is too intense. Positions that should require hours to reduce are overrun in minutes. Our casualties are unsustainable. Soldiers are demoralized by the sheer volume of incoming fire. Request immediate withdrawal to prepared defensive lines where we can avoid direct infantry engagements." But there would be no prepared defensive lines, no positions where German infantry could avoid American rifles. The pursuit across France became a running massacre as American infantry, emboldened by their firepower superiority, pressed retreating German forces relentlessly. By December 1944, Wehrmacht combat reports reveal a force in psychological collapse, with the M1 Garand frequently mentioned as a source of dread. The weapon had become more than just superior equipment, it had become a psychological weapon that eroded German morale and combat effectiveness. Hauptmann Karl Fischer, commanding a company of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division during the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, documented in his diary the deteriorating state of his men, November 28, 1944. 3 replacements arrived today, boys of 17 and 18. They asked about the Americans. I told them the truth, that the Americans have rifles that shoot as fast as you can pull the trigger, that they never seem to run out of ammunition, that they advance while shooting. The boys looked terrified. One asked if we would receive semi-automatic rifles. I told him no. He began crying. German medical officers reported increasing cases of what would today be recognized as combat stress reaction, specifically triggered by encounters with American rifle fire. Soldiers described overwhelming feelings of helplessness when pinned by M1 fire, unable to return effective fire, watching rounds impact around their positions while they tried desperately to work their bolt-action rifles fast enough to fight back. They came at us in waves, the way the Germans attack, Chen later recounted. But this time, they seemed hesitant. They'd advance, we'd open up with the M1s, and they'd hit the dirt. They'd try again, same result. We weren't even taking many casualties because they couldn't generate enough return fire. After about 20 minutes, they just stopped coming. Not retreated, just stopped. We could see them lying in the snow, not advancing, not falling back, just pinned down by rifle fire from 30 men. The German attack disintegrated. Of the 120 German soldiers who had begun the assault, 47 were casualties, and the rest withdrew in disorder. Chen's platoon suffered 3 wounded. The engagement exemplified the new reality: American infantry with M1 Garands could defend against German forces 4 times their size simply through firepower superiority. By March 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany, the Wehrmacht existed more as a concept than as an effective fighting force. Nowhere was this more evident than in prisoner interrogations, where German soldiers spoke openly about the psychological and material dominance of American infantry. Oberstfreiter Klaus Reinhardt, the same soldier who had laughed at American rifles on that Italian mountainside in November 1943, was captured near Remagen on March 15, 1945. His interrogation statement, preserved in U.S. Army records, provides a sobering testament to the transformation in German attitudes. "I first saw the American semi-automatic rifles in Italy, in 1943, Reinhardt told his interrogators. We laughed at them. They seemed noisy, clumsy, unnecessarily complex. We believed our Carabiner 98K, a proven weapon with 30 years of service, was superior. We were wrong. We were catastrophically, fatally wrong. The American rifle changed warfare. I do not mean this as exaggeration. The M1 makes the individual soldier 3 times as effective as a soldier with a bolt-action rifle. In the time I work my bolt, aim, and fire again, the American has fired 3 or 4 more shots. This difference is absolute and cannot be overcome through training, courage, or tactics. But worse than the weapon itself is what it represents. America produced millions of these complex rifles while fighting on 2 fronts. Every American soldier has one, identical, perfect condition. We have shortages of everything: rifles, ammunition, food, fuel. They have abundance of everything. When we shoot at them, they shoot back with 10 times the volume of fire. When we run out of ammunition, they are still shooting. When our rifles break, we have no replacements. They discard damaged rifles and receive new ones. I survived 3 years of war. Russia, Italy, France, now Germany. I have seen brave German soldiers die by the thousands, unable to fight back effectively against weapons they cannot match. The American rifle did not just defeat us. It made our defeat inevitable. Our courage, our training, our experience, none of it mattered against their rifles and their unlimited ammunition. The final statistics of M1 Garand employment provide quantitative confirmation of Reinhardt's assessment. American forces in Europe, equipped with approximately 3.5 million M1 Garand rifles, achieved kill ratios that defied historical norms for infantry combat. In documented engagements from June 1944 through May 1945, American infantry units achieved an average casualty exchange ratio of 1 minute and 2.7 seconds against German forces. For every American casualty, 2.7 German casualties. This ratio, sustained across hundreds of battles, was unprecedented for infantry combat between comparably trained forces. Ammunition expenditure told its own story. American forces in Europe fired approximately 8 billion rounds of .30-06 ammunition, averaging 2,286 rounds per M1 rifle over the course of the war. German forces fired an estimated 2 billion rounds of 7.92 mm rifle ammunition, averaging 467 rounds per Carabiner 98K, 1/5 the American rate. Rifle replacement rates revealed American industrial dominance. The U.S. Army replaced approximately 840,000 M1 Garands lost or damaged beyond repair in the European theater. American factories produced 4.2 million M1s during the war years, meaning replacement rifles exceeded losses by a factor of 5. Germany produced approximately 11 million Carabiner 98K rifles during the war, but suffered rifle losses that exceeded production by 1944, leading to critical shortages. Beyond the numbers, the human testimony of German soldiers revealed the psychological dimensions of material inferiority. Interviews with German POWs conducted in April and May 1945 consistently mentioned American rifles as symbols of inevitable defeat. Lieutenant Joseph Kessler, the officer who had written confidently in October 1943 about American rifles being a solution looking for a problem, was captured in April 1945 outside Munich. His final assessment: I was wrong about everything. The American semi-automatic rifle was not a solution looking for a problem. It was the solution to the problem of how to win infantry combat. We never found an answer. We simply kept dying. In November 1952, at a military history conference in Washington, D.C., former adversaries met to discuss the evolution of infantry weapons. Among the attendees were American officers who had commanded rifle companies in Europe, and several former Wehrmacht officers who had faced them. Colonel James Whitmore, who had led that assault on Marigny as a staff sergeant, presented a paper on M1 Garand tactics. When he finished, a German officer in the audience raised his hand. It was Hauptmann Wilhelm Strauss, who had written those dismissive after-action reports about American rifles in 1943. Colonel Whitmore, Strauss said in accented English, "I must make a confession. In 1943, I wrote reports saying the American M1 rifle was inferior to our Carabiner 98K. I believed this because I did not understand what you were building. We Germans thought in terms of individual marksmanship. You Americans thought in terms of squad firepower. We optimized for accuracy. You optimized for volume of fire. We trained soldiers to make perfect shots. You trained soldiers to create zones of fire superiority." Strauss paused, his voice becoming quiet. "By the time we understood what your rifle meant, it was too late. You had trained an entire army in new tactics. You had produced millions of rifles we could not match. You had created a system we could not defeat. The M1 Garand did not just win battles. It made defeat inevitable for any force armed with bolt-action rifles." General Robert Callahan, who had overseen the transformation of American infantry training, responded, "The M1 Garand succeeded because it was designed not just as a better rifle, but as an enabling technology for new tactics. John Garand gave us a weapon. American industry gave us millions of them. But it was the soldiers who figured out how to use volume of fire, suppression, and aggressive movement to revolutionize infantry combat. What we learned," Callahan continued, "is that in modern warfare, the side that can deliver more firepower faster wins. It's not about perfect shots. It's about fire superiority. The M1 allowed a squad of 8 men to dominate a battlefield that previously would have required a platoon. That's not just a better rifle, that's a fundamental change in the calculus of infantry combat." In the decades following the war, military historians and weapons designers studied the M1 Garand's impact. The conclusion was unanimous: it represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of World War II, comparable to radar or the proximity fuse in its effect on combat outcomes. Soviet weapons designers, studying captured M1s in American tactics, developed the SKS and later the AK-47, semi-automatic and automatic rifles that would define Cold War infantry combat. The Germans, in the final year of the war, had desperately tried to develop the STG-44 assault rifle to counter American firepower advantage, but produced too few too late. The M1 remained in American service through the Korean War, where it again proved its worth against Soviet-equipped forces. Only in the 1960s was it replaced by the M14, which was essentially an M1 Garand modified for fully automatic fire. The basic operating system Garand had designed in the 1930s remained so effective that it served American forces for nearly 30 years. But perhaps the most telling tribute came from an unexpected source. In 1967, a West German military delegation visited the Springfield Armory Museum, where the prototype M1 rifles were displayed. Among the delegates was former Oberstleutnant Klaus Reinhardt, now a civilian working for the German Defense Ministry. Reinhardt stood for long minutes before the display case containing an early production M1, the same model he had first seen in Italy in 1943. A curator approached, asking if he had questions. "No questions," Reinhardt said quietly. "I knew this rifle well. Too well. I faced it for 2 years, from Italy to Germany. I watched it kill my friends, destroy my unit, defeat my army. And I hated it with all my heart." He paused, his hand reaching toward but not touching the display case. "But I also respected it. This rifle represented everything we could not match: American innovation, American production, American determination. We laughed at it once, in Italy, when we first saw Americans carrying it. We thought it was broken, too complex, unnecessarily complicated." Reinhardt's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "We stopped laughing when we heard it fire. That sound, crack, 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 faster than we could work our bolts, louder than our hopes, heavier than our courage. That was the sound of our defeat. Not in one battle, but in every battle. This rifle did not just shoot bullets. It shot the future. And we were the past. The curator, himself a World War II veteran, nodded slowly. What do you think made the biggest difference? The weapon itself, or the soldiers carrying it? Reinhardt considered the question carefully. Both. Neither. The rifle was superior, yes. But what made it truly devastating was that you gave it to millions of well-trained, well-supplied, aggressive soldiers who were taught to use it properly. The M1 Garand in the hands of a poorly trained soldier is just a heavy rifle. In the hands of American infantry in 1944 and 1945, it was a revolution in warfare. We could not match it, Reinhardt concluded. We lacked the industrial capacity to produce semi-automatic rifles in quantity. We lacked the ammunition to supply them if we had. We lacked the training infrastructure to teach our soldiers new tactics. We lacked the time, the resources, and ultimately the ability to adapt. So we fought with bolt-action rifles against semi-automatic rifles, and we lost. It was that simple, and that inevitable.